So if at any point people want to ask specific questions to the editors, feel free to raise your hand. But I've just prepared a few questions here. So I'm sure you've seen that there's quite a few different types of papers that come out, sometimes with multiple authors, sometimes with single authors. So would you say that authorship, the order of the authorship matters? And as a first author, what types of responsibilities come with that? Yeah, it's open to everybody.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, it matters. To put it quite frankly, the first author usually does the hard work. The second and the last author usually are the ones who are closely supervising not just the writing of the manuscript, but the entire research process. And anyone else who contributes, but who really contributes, qualifies him or herself for a position in between the third place and the last place. Yeah, and also in terms of not just for submitting the manuscript, because also the communication over the manuscript, usually I think the first author usually deals with all the communications, but also for your own interest, if you are into research, because why would you otherwise submit your manuscript to a scientific journal? Also the positions of on a manuscript do count big time.
Yeah, if I just add one thing, I think what needs to be clear, we might not sort of like ask you for evidence of this, but it needs to be clear for your own writing, is that everyone who is actually on the paper needs to have made a significant contribution to the project that you are sort of like reporting. That's very, very important. And contribution in this sense means not just reading the final paper, but actually either a contribution in terms of design, if this was a study, design, data collection, analysis, and write-up. So if none of these things have actually happened with that particular person, then the person probably shouldn't be on the paper. Now, that's a thumb rule, of course. You know, there are some other things people can do still to get on the paper. You know, statistical support, etc. But it's important that you make that clear before you start writing the paper, who's going to be on it and what sort of their contribution will be. Now, in medical literature, usually, apart from what Bert said, the first author is usually the one who's writing. Usually, in the medical literature, the project lead, the principal investigator, goes last, unless that person is actually writing the paper itself as well. But that's not really commonplace in our journal. I'm not quite sure what it is in your journal, but you can still adhere to that rule if you wanted to. That's not a problem for us, so that it's recognizable that the PI is in the last position of the sequence of authors. Okay.
So for emerging researchers, a lot of the times we do end up doing the brunt of the work. And what ends up happening when you haven't quite found your voice yet is that when it comes to authorship, it's a little bit hard to maybe push a little bit and say, hey, I actually did write the whole manuscript, how come I'm not first? So I guess I'm wondering, is it common to see disputes over authorship? And if you could offer any mitigation strategies?
Well, I think it's a very true and it's a very good question. I personally was always very lucky that my professors, when I wrote my PhD, always acknowledged that I'd be the first author. Mm-hmm. But that's not common practice, and I know that. I think it's very much on the professors actually to recognize that you need to also support your emerging researchers and your young researchers in being published, as long as you ensure that it's the right quality. I'm sure that there's a lot of, or there might be discussions, and there are professors who just expect to be, but usually they expect to be last authors and not first authors, is my experience as well. And I also think that it's slowly changing, I have to say, in that, first of all, your generation is so much more demanding than previous generations were, which is good, absolutely. But also, I think it's also a fair question for you to pose and to say, look, I've put in a lot of work, you've helped me develop it, you've guided me, but actually it should be me as the first author and you as the last or the second author. I don't know. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of sort of like entitlement, kind of like tussle going on sometimes, but actually I think we all just have, as senior researchers, we have to be generous, I think, with early career researchers, especially nothing is perfect at that stage, and we really need to give them, you know, the help they need and the support they need to get through this, and that's also what the journal editors, Victoria, would do as well. You know, if you have a question or if you have a problem, you know, how to actually formulate it, how do I get beyond that outline? Do get in touch with us. You know, that's a really important source, hopefully, of information and help as well.
So you've also talked a little bit about impact factors and how the different journals have different scores. How important is that when you're actually selecting a journal? So say you have a journal that is maybe 1.5, but then it's an open access journal, and then you have another one that is a closed access journal, or like say something like Nature, which is really high. And congrats to you if you've ever published in Nature. But I guess, how do you go about selecting a journal based on impact factor, and should it even matter?
Well, it does matter, because usually that's how you get funded, or that's partly of how universities also evaluate you as a researcher, and whether you get funding or not, or whether you are promoted or not. It's so yes, I think the question here is, it's back to you as an author. What is it that what do you need, really? Is this an article that you do because you're convinced of it and you want to publish it no matter what, and you want to select then maybe a journal that has not such a high impact, but you get it to the relevant audience? Or is it an article that you really need to look at the impact factor because it's maybe also part of a bigger project? It's part of a university funded project, and so you need to prove to the university that you use the funds wisely as well. So I think it's a very difficult line. I know at many of the big universities it is still one of the biggest defining factors of where do I submit first, really.
I probably see it as slightly more sort of like subtle. What I would say is the various publishers moving to various different approaches to the impact factor. Now, there's one impact factor that's obviously, you know, the one that ICIC has, and that's simply number of citations divided by, you know, sort of I think it's the count of articles over 2 years. Now, that's a technical one. I recently published a Cochrane review. The impact factor is 6 point something. Does it matter? Actually, in my field, for the ref next year, that's a sort of like research assessment framework. Next year for my university, actually it doesn't, because I'm in nursing. You know, the impact factor doesn't really matter. Is it a great publication? Probably, it's okay, you know, but I'm more proud of some of the things that I publish in my own journal or other journals that are more text-based than this sort of very highly structured Cochrane review. So it's really about what you want to do, who you want to reach, and how can you reach that particular audience, that readership. That's very, very important. And I think you can, again, have that discussion with Victoria, Bert, and myself. You know, where do you want to be with that paper? And I think that's important, a conversation to have.
Let me put it very bold. The impact factor is really old school thinking. So I do know that a lot of universities and that maybe a lot of your your fellow researchers, they do regard the impact factor as an important quality indicator. Please let them look at the Declaration of Research Assessment signed in San Francisco a few years ago. I think it's gradually changing, so that's DORA in short. I can't recognize that there's still a lot of emphasis on the impact factor. But really, Altmetrics, Kudos, and so on. So there are so many other platforms. Look a bit around you and start looking at some other indicators as well.
Thank you so much. I guess I'd like to maybe open it up to the floor if you have specific questions to the editors.
Is it important how many years after doing the research itself I'm trying to publish it? Because I did my master's degree like 6 years ago. I tried to publish it a year after it. It didn't get accepted, so I dropped it out. And my professor is always asking me, what about it? And I'm like, it was 6 years ago. Of course, it is still important to publish it, but is it? They would say it's like from 6 years ago, the data collection, so.
That's a very relevant question as well. Thank you for that. Yes, we definitely look at that. And I would say it depends a bit on what kind of research you did. So for most of the studies, we would say that it's too long ago. But if it's more conceptual, for example, or if it's more something that that has impact, that is still relevant, then yes, we would still say, even though it's maybe 6 years ago, but it's still relevant, it's still answering questions that we're asking ourselves, we would still publish it. So it depends also a bit on if it's a very data-driven set, then it's probably too old. But if it's more of the conceptual or a case study, for example, then often what we do is we actually go back to the authors and say, this is 6 years ago, could you please just add some text or explain why did it take so long? And is there some kind of at least follow-up in the discussion to say, this is what happened since?
Any other questions?
Can I just say thank you very much to IFIC actually for inviting us and giving us an opportunity to share this with you. And of course, do get in touch.
Absolutely, and I think with that, it's time to close because we do have another session opening up here. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.